The throne room fell silent the moment the laugh escaped her lips. Lyra Ashworth had not meant to laugh. She had walked into the castle of the Alpha King, carrying a leather satchel full of herbs, exhausted from 3 days of travel, ready to hand over medicine and leave before anyone noticed her. She had heard the stories about King Draven Voss. Everyone in the 9 territories had heard them. He was the strongest alpha alive, a man who had won a war before he turned 25, a man whose enemies vanished and were never spoken of again. She had expected a monster. She had expected fear to close her throat the moment she saw him. Instead, she saw his scar, and something in her chest simply gave way. It ran from his left eyebrow down to his jaw, thick and uneven, pale against his dark skin. It was not the scar itself that struck her. It was the shape of it, the healer in her, the part of her mind that had spent years stitching wounds on farmers and soldiers and children, recognized bad work when she saw it. Someone had closed that wound in a hurry, with a shaking hand, without any real skill. It was crooked in a way that looked almost comic, like a child's drawing of a lightning bolt. She laughed before she even understood she was doing it. It was short, involuntary, and much too loud in a room built of marble and silence. Every guard in the chamber turned to stone. The advisors near the throne stopped breathing. Someone near the back of the hall made a small strangled sound, as if they had personally been struck. Lyra felt the laugh die in her throat as fast as it had come, but it was too late. It had already happened. It could not be unheard. King Draven Voss did not move. He sat with one arm resting along the carved wolf's head on his throne, his eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read. He was not smiling. He was not frowning either. He simply watched her the way a predator watches something that has wandered too close without noticing the danger. The captain of the guard, a broad man with a nervous jaw, stepped forward first. "Kneel," he barked at her. "Kneel before the king, healer, or I swear." "She will not kneel," Draven said. His voice was low, even, unhurried. It carried across the stone hall without effort, the way thunder carries across an open field long before the storm arrives. The captain froze mid-step, clearly unsure whether he had just been given mercy or a warning. Lyra's heart pounded so hard she thought the whole court could hear it. She had grown up in Ashfen, a border pack so small and poor that most maps did not bother naming it. She had healed broken bones with her bare hands since she was 12 years old. She had faced down wounded wolves twice her size, screaming men bleeding out on wooden tables, mothers who begged her to save children she could not save. She was not easily frightened, but she had never faced anything like this. Draven rose from his throne. He was tall, taller than she had expected, with the kind of build that came from decades of real fighting, rather than palace training. He walked down the steps slowly, each footstep echoing, and the entire court seemed to lean away from him as he passed, as though his presence pushed the air itself aside. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at him, close enough that she could see the scar was even worse than she had thought from a distance, the stitching lines still faintly visible beneath the skin, mismatched and clumsy. "You laughed," he said. It was not a question, but she felt compelled to answer anyway. "I did. Do you know what happens to people who mock me in my own hall?" Around them, nobody moved. A serving girl near the far wall had gone pale as chalk. An old advisor with silver hair had actually closed his eyes, as though bracing for something terrible. Lyra understood, in that moment, that people had likely died for smaller offenses than hers. She understood that the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do, was to fall to her knees and beg for forgiveness and hope that would be enough. She did not do that. "I wasn't mocking you," she said instead. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I was mocking whoever stitched that wound, because whoever did it should never be allowed near a needle again as long as they live." A ripple went through the hall. Someone gasped. The captain of the guard looked like he might faint on the spot. Draven's eyes narrowed, just slightly, and for one terrible heartbeat Lyra was certain she had spoken her last words as a free woman. Then something shifted in his expression. It was small, barely visible, gone as quickly as it appeared, but for that one instant, the corner of his mouth twitched, as if a laugh of his own had tried to escape and been crushed before it could form. "Explain," he said. "The stitches are uneven," Lyra said, professional instinct taking over now, pushing the fear down beneath years of practiced calm. See how the spacing changes here and here? Whoever treated you was either panicking, untrained, or both. A wound that size should have healed cleaner. It should not have scarred this thick if it had been closed properly in the first hour. Someone failed you, Your Majesty. I was not laughing at your face. I was laughing at their incompetence. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was not the silence of horror. It was the silence of an entire room, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Draven studied her for a long moment. Up close, she could see faint gold flecks in his dark eyes, a color that seemed to catch what little light slipped through the tall windows. He smelled of pine and steel, and something underneath that she could not name, something that made her wolf stir faintly beneath her skin, though she pushed that feeling aside immediately. This was not the time to notice anything about him beyond the danger he represented. You are a healer, he said finally. I am. From Ashfen. I brought medicine for your border elders, as requested by your steward 3 months ago. I did not come here to insult my king. And yet you did. Accidentally, she said. Which is different from intentionally, if your majesty is willing to consider the distinction. A low sound came from somewhere near the throne. It took Lyra a moment to realize it was laughter, quiet and disbelieving, from one of the older advisors, quickly smothered behind a raised hand. Nobody else dared make a sound. Draven turned his head slightly, and whatever look he gave the advisor was enough to silence even that. Then his attention returned fully to Lyra, and she felt the weight of it like a physical thing pressing against her chest. No one in this hall has laughed at me in 11 years, he said. No one has dared to say the word incompetent within these walls, since before you were likely old enough to hold a blade. You understand what a strange thing you have just done. I understand it was foolish, Lyra admitted. But it wasn't cruel. There's a difference between the two, even if it doesn't always look that way from a throne. Something flickered behind his eyes again, quicker this time, harder to name. It might have been anger. It might have been something closer to curiosity. Lyra could not tell, and the not knowing frightened her more than open rage would have. The captain of the guard finally found his voice again. My king, shall we take her to the silence? Draven said, without looking away from Lyra. I have not decided what to do with her yet. The words hung in the air, heavy and unreadable. Lyra felt every eye in the room settle on her, waiting, judging, some clearly hoping for a punishment, dramatic enough to be talked about for years. Others simply relieved that the tension in the room had not yet broken into violence. I am not finished with this conversation, Draven said at last, turning to address the room rather than her. The healer will remain within the castle until I have decided what her insolence is worth. See that she is given quarters. See that she is not harmed. A murmur ran through the court, confusion and disbelief tangled together. Guards exchanged glances. The old advisor who had laughed looked almost pleased, though he quickly rearranged his expression into something more neutral when Draven's gaze passed near him again. Lyra opened her mouth to protest, to explain that she had a pact to return to, medicine still owed to 2 other border settlements, an elder back home whose fever she had promised to check within the week. But something in Draven's expression told her that arguing further would not help her case, and might in fact undo whatever strange mercy had just been extended to her. Yes, Your Majesty, she said instead, forcing the words out evenly. Draven studied her for one more long moment, as though trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit together the way he expected. Then he turned and walked back toward his throne without another word, his long coat trailing behind him like a shadow given shape. The court exhaled as one body the moment his back was turned, as though the entire hall had been holding its breath since the laugh first slipped free. A woman in pale blue robes approached Lyra quickly, her face tight with barely restrained panic. Come with me, she whispered, quickly, before he changes his mind. Lyra followed, her legs unsteady beneath her, her mind spinning through everything that had just happened. She had come to this castle expecting to deliver medicine and leave within the hour. Instead, she was being led through corridors of cold stone toward quarters she had never asked for, held in a castle she had never wanted to enter, because of a laugh she could not take back. As they walked, she caught sight of the court through an open archway, still murmuring amongst themselves, still glancing toward the throne where the king now sat once more, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on something none of them could see. She did not understand yet what she had started. She only understood, with a cold certainty settling into her stomach, that nothing about her life was going to look the same after today. Behind her, unseen, Draven Voss touched 2 fingers briefly to the scar along his jaw, an old habit he had not indulged in years, and for the first time since the war that gave it to him, he found himself thinking less about the wound and more about the woman who had dared to laugh at it. The healer's quarters were nothing like Lyra had expected from a castle built to intimidate an entire kingdom. The room was small, tucked at the end of a narrow corridor on the 3rd floor, with a single window that looked out over the training yards below. A simple bed, a wash basin, a wooden chair, and a shelf holding a few unused candles made up the whole of it. It felt less like a punishment and more like an afterthought, as though no one had truly decided what to do with her, and had simply placed her somewhere out of the way until they figured it out. She spent the first night pacing the small space, running through everything that had happened, replaying the moment the laugh left her mouth, as though she could somehow reach back through time and swallow it before it escaped. Sleep came in short, broken pieces, interrupted by the sound of boots in the hallway and the distant howl of wolves somewhere beyond the castle walls. By morning, she had convinced herself that the king had simply forgotten about her, that whatever strange mercy he had shown in the throne room had faded overnight into indifference, and that she would be quietly released within a day or two, once someone remembered she existed. She was wrong. A guard arrived just after sunrise, his expression carefully blank in the way of someone trained not to show curiosity, even when he clearly felt it. "The king requests your presence," he said. "You are to bring your healing supplies." Lyra gathered her satchel with hands that were not entirely steady, and followed him through corridors that seemed even colder in daylight than they had the night before. Servants pressed themselves against the walls as they passed, whispering behind their hands the moment she was a few steps ahead. She heard fragments of it. The healer who laughed, the one who insulted the king and lived. Word had clearly traveled fast within these walls. She was led not to the throne room this time, but to a private study on the 2nd floor, smaller and warmer than the grand hall, lined with shelves of old books, and lit by a fire crackling in a wide stone hearth. Draven stood near the window when she entered, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. "You wanted to see me, Your Majesty," Lyra said, forcing her voice to stay even. He turned. In daylight, without the shadows of the throne room hiding parts of his face, the scar looked even more pronounced, and Lyra had to consciously stop herself from studying it, the way a healer studies a problem to be solved. "You said my wound was closed poorly," Draven said, without preamble. "I want to know what you meant." Lyra blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "You brought me here to discuss stitching technique?" "I brought you here because no one in this castle has told me the truth about anything in 11 years, he said. "You did, without meaning to. I find that I would like to hear more of it." It was such an unexpected answer that Lyra did not know how to respond at first. She had imagined a dozen different fates for herself overnight, ranging from execution to imprisonment to simple banishment, and none of them had involved the most feared alpha in the 9 territories asking her, quite plainly, to critique the medical care he had received over a decade ago. "May I look at it properly?" she asked. "In better light, I mean. I only saw it from a distance yesterday." Something crossed his face, quick and guarded, gone before she could name it. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. Then he crossed the room and sat in the chair near the fire, tilting his head slightly to allow her a clearer view. Lyra approached carefully, aware of every guard positioned near the door, aware of the strange intimacy of the moment, despite the very public nature of the room. She leaned close, studying the scar with the same focused attention she would give any wound, pushing aside the awareness of how close she now stood to him, how she could feel warmth radiating from his skin, how his gold-flecked eyes tracked her every movement. "This should never have scarred this badly," she said after a moment, tracing a careful finger just above the skin without touching it. "Whoever treated you rushed the closure. See here, where the edges don't quite align, and here, where the stitches are too far apart. A wound this deep, left in a hurry like this, would have pulled and reopened more than once before it finally healed. That's why the scar tissue is so thick." "There was a battle," Draven said quietly. "There was very little time for anything to be done carefully." Lyra softened slightly at that, some of her clinical detachment slipping. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sound as though I was blaming anyone for circumstances beyond their control. You are the first person who has spoken to me about this scar, without either avoiding it entirely or offering empty flattery. Draven said, "My court pretends it does not exist. My advisors act as though commenting on it would be treason. You looked at it and told me the truth, even knowing what it might cost you." "It nearly did cost me quite a lot," Lyra pointed out. The faintest trace of something like amusement flickered at the corner of his mouth. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but Lyra had seen it clearly enough this time to know she had not imagined it. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Tell me about Ashfin." It was not a request phrased as one, but there was something different in his tone now, something less like command and more like genuine curiosity. Lyra hesitated only a moment before taking the offered seat, setting her satchel down beside her. She told him about her small border pack, tucked between two mountain ranges, too far from the capital for anyone to bother protecting properly, too poor to attract the interest of ambitious nobles looking to expand their influence. She told him about the fever that had swept through 2 winters ago, killing a dozen children before she had found the right combination of herbs to break it. She told him about learning to set bones by candlelight, because there had never been enough coin to bring in a proper physician, about teaching herself from old texts scavenged from a burned library, about losing patience she should have been able to save if she had simply known more. Draven listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable but attentive, his gold-flecked eyes fixed on her the entire time, as though she were the only interesting thing in the room. It was strange, speaking so openly to a man capable of ending her life with a single word, but something about the quiet study, the crackling fire, the careful way he asked follow-up questions, made it easier than it should have been. "You could have stayed in the capital," he said eventually. "Trained properly, earned a position in a real healing house, instead of scraping by on a border no one remembers." "Someone has to look after Ashfen," Lyra said simply. "If not me, then who?" Something in his expression shifted again at that, something she could not quite name, something that looked almost like respect, though she told herself she was likely imagining it. "You will return to your quarters for now," Draven said, rising from his chair, the moment of openness closing as quickly as it had opened. "I have decided you will remain in the castle a while longer, not as punishment, as a guest, until I determine what use your honesty might serve here." Lyra wanted to argue, wanted to explain again about the medicine still owed to other settlements, about the elder whose fever she had promised to monitor, but something in his tone told her the decision had already been made, and that arguing would accomplish nothing beyond wasting both their time. "As you wish, Your Majesty," she said instead, gathering her satchel and rising to leave. At the door, she paused and glanced back at him. He stood near the fire once more, his profile lit by the flickering light, the scar along his jaw catching shadow in a way that made it look almost deliberate, almost like a mark of survival, rather than failure. "For what it's worth," she said, before she could stop herself. "The scar doesn't make you look weak. It makes you look like someone who lived through something that should have killed him. There's a difference." She left before he could respond, before she could see whatever expression crossed his face at her words. And it was only once she was back in the cold corridor, her heart pounding for reasons she did not fully understand, that she allowed herself to wonder what exactly she had just started. Behind the closed door, Draven Voss stood very still for a long moment, one hand resting against the mantel of the fireplace, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. It had been 11 years since anyone had spoken to him about that night without flinching, without lowering their eyes, without treating the subject as something too dangerous to touch. 11 years since anyone had made him feel like a man who had survived something, rather than a king defined entirely by what he had lost. He was not entirely certain what to do with the feeling settling in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome, and impossible to ignore. He only knew that he was not ready, yet, to send the healer from Ashfen back to her small border pack. Word of the healer's continued presence in the castle spread through the halls faster than any official announcement could have managed. By the end of the first week, Lyra had become the single most discussed subject among servants, guards, and nobles alike, though the discussions took very different shapes depending on who was doing the talking. Among the serving staff, she had become something of a quiet hero, whispered about with a kind of awed respect. She was the woman who had insulted the king and lived, the one who had somehow turned an unforgivable offense into an invitation to stay. Young maids found excuses to walk past her quarters, hoping for a glimpse of the healer who had done what no one else in living memory had dared. Among the nobles, the reaction was considerably less warm. Lady Seraphine Blackwood, daughter of one of the oldest and most powerful families in the 9 territories, made her opinion known within days of Lyra's arrival, becoming permanent rather than temporary. She had spent the better part of 3 years carefully positioning herself as the most likely candidate to become the king's Luna, cultivating alliances, attending every function, ensuring her presence was felt in every corner of court life that mattered. The sudden appearance of an unknown border healer, granted private audiences with the king under the thin pretense of medical consultation, was not something she intended to ignore. "She is a healer," Seraphine said dismissively, to a cluster of noblewomen gathered near the garden fountains, her voice pitched just loud enough to ensure it carried. "A common healer from some forgotten pack no one has ever heard of. The king is simply curious about her rustic manners. It will pass." But it did not pass, and everyone in the castle knew it, even as they pretended otherwise for Seraphine's benefit. Draven summoned Lyra again, 3 days after their first private conversation, this time under the pretense of having her examine an old injury to his shoulder that had never healed quite right. Lyra suspected, though she did not say so, that the shoulder was simply an excuse, a reason he could offer his advisors for why the border healer kept appearing in his private study, rather than being sent home as any reasonable ruler would have done by now. She did not mind the excuse. If anything, she found herself looking forward to these strange, quiet meetings, more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. "Tell me something true," Draven said one evening, as she worked careful fingers along the old injury in his shoulder, feeling for the places where the muscle had healed wrong, where scar tissue had built up beneath the skin, in ways that still caused him pain on cold mornings. "About what?" Lyra asked. "Anything. My advisors tell me only what they think I want to hear. My court flatters me, until the words mean nothing. I would like, for once, to hear something true." Lyra considered this for a moment, her hands still moving carefully over his shoulder. "You favor your right side when you walk," she said finally. "Have you noticed? It's subtle, but it's there. I would guess this shoulder still troubles you more than you let anyone see." Draven went very still beneath her hands. "No one has noticed that." "No one has been looking as closely as I have," Lyra said simply. "It's my job to notice these things." "And what else have you noticed?" Lyra hesitated, weighing how much honesty was truly wise, then decided that if he wanted truth, she would give it to him plainly. "You do not sleep well. There are shadows beneath your eyes that no amount of rest during the day seems to fix. You touch your scar without realizing it when you are thinking about something difficult. And you have not smiled once, truly smiled, in all the time I have spent in this castle, though I suspect you used to. Once, before whatever happened to you happened." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Lyra wondered if she had finally pushed too far, said too much, forgotten the very real danger of the man sitting before her despite the strange comfort that had grown between them over these past days. "You are correct," Draven said finally, so quietly she almost missed it. "About all of it." "What happened to you?" Lyra asked, before she could stop herself. "The scar, I mean, and whatever came with it." She expected him to refuse, to close the conversation the way he had closed so many others whenever they veered too close to something personal. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, his jaw tight with something that looked almost like old grief, finally allowed to surface. "There was a war," he said slowly. 11 years ago, a rival pack, the Ravenshallow line, moved against our border territories, seeking to claim land that had belonged to my family for generations. I led the defense myself, as any alpha would. We won, eventually, but the cost was high. He paused, his fingers rising unconsciously to touch the scar along his jaw, exactly as Lyra had described a moment before. "I had a mate," he continued, his voice carefully controlled, each word measured, as though speaking too quickly might break something. "Ilara. She fought beside me, as was her right and her wish. During the final battle, a Ravenshallow warrior struck me from behind. Here." He touched the scar again. "Ilara saw it happen. She threw herself between us, to stop the second blow. She did not survive." Lyra's hands stilled completely, her chest tightening with a grief that was not her own, but felt heavy all the same. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. The wound was closed in the field, hours later, by whichever healer could be found in the chaos of the aftermath. Draven continued, as though he needed to finish the story now that he had begun it. I do not remember much of it. I remember only that I did not care, at the time, whether it healed well or poorly. I did not care about much of anything, for a long while after that. And since then? Lyra asked gently. Since then, I have ruled, he said, and something in his tone hardened again, the openness of the moment, before retreating behind familiar walls. Coldly. Efficiently. Without allowing myself to feel very much of anything, because feeling had cost me everything I loved once already. Lyra sat with that for a long moment, understanding suddenly so much more about the man in front of her than she had before. The distance in his eyes, the way the entire court seemed to hold its breath around him, the careful control in every word, every movement, as though he had spent 11 years building walls brick by brick to ensure nothing could ever hurt him that badly again. You cannot heal a wound by refusing to feel it, she said quietly. Believe me, I know something about wounds. The ones that scar the worst are always the ones people try hardest to ignore. Draven turned to look at her then, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face for just a moment, before the familiar composure returned. Perhaps, he said. Or perhaps some wounds are better left buried, for everyone's safety. That sounds like fear talking, Lyra said, not wisdom. She saw something flash in his eyes at that, quick and sharp, and for a moment, she feared she had gone too far again. But instead of anger, what settled over his features was something closer to reluctant consideration, as though her words had landed somewhere he could not easily dismiss. You speak to me with a boldness no one else in this castle would dare, he said finally. I find I do not entirely mind it, though I probably should. Would you prefer I lied to you instead? Lyra asked. Told you what you wanted to hear, the way everyone else does. No, Draven said, and the word came out with more force than the question required, as though the thought of losing this particular honesty troubled him more than he expected. No, I would not prefer that at all. Outside the study, unseen by either of them, Lady Seraphine stood just beyond the door, her hand frozen against the frame, having come to request an audience of her own, only to find herself unable to move, once she heard the tone of the conversation drifting through the gap. Her expression, in the dim corridor light, had gone cold and calculating, the beginnings of a plan already forming behind her carefully composed features. She had spent 3 years cultivating the king's favor through patience, strategy, and careful presentation. She was not about to lose her position to a border healer who had wandered into the castle by accident and somehow made herself indispensable through nothing more than blunt honesty and lucky timing. Something would need to be done about Lyra Ashworth, and soon, before whatever was growing between the healer and the king became something neither of them could easily walk away from. The rumors began quietly at first, the way rot always begins quietly, hidden beneath the surface before anyone notices the damage spreading. It started with small comments dropped carelessly among the noblewomen who gathered each afternoon near the castle gardens, comments about how strange it was that a border healer had somehow captured so much of the king's private attention in such a short time. It moved to murmured questions about what exactly happened during those long private meetings in his study, meetings that stretched later into the evening with each passing week. By the second month of Lyra's stay, the whispers had shifted into something far more dangerous, something with teeth. Witchcraft, the whispers said. No ordinary healer could hold a king's attention this way, without some manner of unnatural influence. Perhaps her herbs were not simple remedies at all, but something far more calculated, something designed to bind his will to hers. Lyra first heard the accusation directly from a young serving girl named Wendy, who delivered her morning meal with hands that trembled slightly as she set the tray down. They're saying things about you, Wendy whispered, glancing nervously toward the door, as though someone might be listening. In the kitchens, that you've bewitched the king somehow, that it isn't natural, the way he keeps you close. That's ridiculous, Lyra said, though a cold feeling settled in her stomach at the words. I'm a healer, not a witch. There's a considerable difference. I know that, Wendy said quickly. Everyone who's actually met you knows that. But Lady Seraphine has been saying it to anyone who will listen, and people are starting to believe her, or at least starting to wonder. Lyra set down her spoon, her appetite gone entirely. She had suspected, of course, that her continued presence in the castle would not sit well with everyone. particularly not with the noblewoman she had noticed watching her with cold, assessing eyes whenever their paths crossed in the corridors. But she had not expected the rumors to escalate this quickly, or this dangerously. Witchcraft accusations were not taken lightly in the 9 territories. She had heard stories, growing up, of women accused of similar things in packs less enlightened than her own, women who had faced trials that were little more than formalities before their inevitable punishment. She had always assumed such practices belonged to a darker, more superstitious past. Now, sitting in a castle far from home with rumors of witchcraft circling closer each day, she was no longer certain that assumption was safe. She raised the matter with Draven that evening, choosing her words carefully as she sat across from him in his study, the fire casting long shadows across the room. "There are rumors circulating about me," she said. "Some of them are becoming quite serious." Draven's expression sharpened immediately, the careful ease that had grown between them over the past weeks, replaced by something colder, more alert. "What kind of rumors?" "That I've bewitched you somehow," Lyra said plainly, refusing to soften the words even though speaking them aloud made her stomach twist with unease. "That my herbs are not simple remedies but something used to influence your mind." Draven's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing visibly beneath the old scar. "Who is spreading this?" "I don't know for certain," Lyra said, though she suspected she had a fairly good idea. "But it's spreading quickly enough that people who barely know me are starting to look at me differently in the halls." "I will put an end to it," Draven said, rising from his chair, with a sharpness that made Lyra flinch slightly. "Please don't make it worse," she said quickly. "If you punish someone publicly for spreading rumors about me, it will only confirm to everyone that there's something worth hiding. It will make the accusations seem more credible, not less." Draven paused, clearly forcing himself to consider her words, despite the anger visible in every line of his posture. "Then what would you have me do?" "Nothing, for now," Lyra said. "Let it die on its own. Rumors without evidence tend to lose their power eventually, as long as nothing feeds them further." He did not look entirely convinced, but he sat back down slowly, some of the tension easing from his shoulders, though his eyes remained troubled. "I do not like the idea of you facing this alone." "I'm not entirely alone," Lyra said, offering a small, tired smile. "I have you listening to me right now, don't I?" Something shifted in his expression at that, something warmer than the careful distance he usually maintained even during their most open conversations. "You do," he said quietly, "for whatever that is worth." But the rumors did not die on their own, as Lyra had hoped they would. If anything, they seemed to grow bolder with each passing day, fed carefully and deliberately by someone who understood exactly how to make a story spread without ever being seen doing it directly. Lady Seraphine was too skilled, too experienced in the subtle art of court manipulation, to be caught spreading rumors directly herself. Instead, she planted seeds in careful conversations, expressed concern rather than accusation, wondered aloud to trusted friends whether the king's judgment had perhaps been clouded by something unnatural, all while maintaining a face of perfect innocence whenever the topic arose in more public settings. "I only worry for our king," she said one afternoon, to a small gathering of noblewomen in the castle gardens, her voice carrying just enough concern to sound genuine. "He has not been himself since the healer arrived. Surely you've all noticed the change. A man who once ruled with perfect clarity now spends his evenings closeted away with a border healer of unknown origin. It troubles me deeply." The words spread exactly as she intended, twisted slightly with each retelling, growing more sinister with every repetition, until half the castle believed some version of the story that painted Lyra as a dangerous influence working her way into the king's confidence through unnatural means. Lyra felt the shift in how people looked at her within days. Servants who had once smiled warmly now averted their eyes when she passed. Guards who had grown friendly over the weeks became stiff and formal again, as though reminding themselves of proper distance. Even Wendy, who had first warned her of the rumors, began to seem uneasy in her presence, though she never stopped bringing meals or offering small kindnesses when she could. Lyra tried not to let it show how much the isolation weighed on her, tried to maintain the same steady confidence she had always carried, but the constant weight of suspicious eyes and whispered conversations cut behind her back began to wear at something deep inside her resolve. She found herself, more and more, looking forward to her evenings with Draven, not simply because of the strange connection growing between them, but because his study had become the one place in the entire castle where she did not feel like something dangerous to be watched and whispered about. "You seem troubled," Draven observed one evening, studying her closely as she worked in careful silence, mixing herbs for a tonic he had requested, though she suspected by now that half his requests for her services were simply excuses to spend time in her company. "The rumors are getting worse," she admitted. "I try not to let it bother me, but it's difficult when it feels like the entire castle is watching for evidence of something that doesn't exist." Draven was quiet for a long moment, his gold-flecked eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel, briefly, that he could see straight through whatever composure she was trying to maintain. "I will find out who is responsible," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous in a way that reminded Lyra, briefly, of the man who had once been described to her as the most feared alpha in the 9 territories. "And when I do, they will understand precisely why spreading falsehoods about someone under my protection is a mistake they will regret." "I appreciate that," Lyra said carefully, "but please, be careful how you handle it. Whoever is responsible clearly understands court politics far better than I do. I would rather you not walk into a trap set specifically to make things worse." Draven's expression softened slightly at her concern for his position, even in the midst of her own troubles. "You worry about my well-being even now." "Someone has to," Lyra said, echoing words she had spoken once before, about her small border pack, about the responsibility she had always carried toward the people around her, whether they asked for her concern or not. Something passed between them in that moment, quiet and unspoken, a recognition of something building steadily beneath the surface of their careful conversations, something neither of them had yet named, but both of them had begun to feel with growing certainty. Outside the castle walls, unseen by either of them, riders from a distant territory moved quietly through the forest paths under cover of darkness, carrying messages that would soon complicate everything, far beyond the reach of court rumors and whispered accusations. The hunting party had been Draven's idea, a rare excursion beyond the castle walls, meant to clear his head after weeks of mounting political tension. He had invited a small group, mostly trusted advisors and a handful of guards, and almost as an afterthought, Lyra, whom he claimed needed fresh mountain herbs that only grew in the wilder territories beyond the castle grounds. Lyra suspected the herbs were, once again, simply an excuse. The morning had started peacefully enough, sunlight filtering gold through the tall pines, the air crisp with the promise of autumn settling over the mountains. Lyra rode near the back of the group, gathering plants along the trail while the others hunted ahead, the distant sound of hooves and occasional laughter carrying back to her through the trees. She had wandered slightly further from the main group than she probably should have, drawn by a patch of silverleaf growing along a rocky outcrop, when the first scream shattered the quiet morning air. It happened fast, the way real danger always happens fast, faster than the mind can properly process before the body is already forced to react. A group of warriors, wearing colors Lyra did not recognize, burst from the tree line in a coordinated ambush that scattered the hunting party in seconds. Lyra froze for one crucial heartbeat, her mind struggling to catch up with what her eyes were seeing, before instinct took over and she scrambled backward toward the cover of a fallen tree. She saw Draven immediately, already transformed into his wolf form, larger than she had ever imagined a wolf could be, dark fur bristling with fury, as he moved to intercept 2 of the attackers bearing down on one of his guards. The fight unfolded in a blur of motion, snarling and shouting, and the harsh clash of steel against claw, and Lyra pressed herself flat against the fallen tree, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not see the third attacker until he was almost upon her. He came from her blind side, moving fast and low, clearly having noticed her isolation from the rest of the group, and identified her as an easy target. Lyra scrambled backward, reaching desperately for the small blade she kept in her satchel for cutting herbs, knowing even as her fingers closed around it that it would be nowhere near enough to stop a trained warrior. She did not need it. Draven appeared between them so quickly she barely registered the movement, a blur of dark fur and raw power that slammed into the attacker with enough force to send him crashing into the nearest tree trunk. But the attacker had been ready for the intervention, twisting at the last moment to drive a blade deep into Draven's side just before the impact. Draven's snarl of pain was the loudest sound Lyra had ever heard, and it broke something open in her chest. A fear so sharp and immediate that she found herself moving, before conscious thought caught up with instinct, throwing herself toward him, even as the attacker scrambled to his feet, clearly intending to finish what he had started. She never found out what he intended to do next, because at that moment, 2 of the king's guards arrived, cutting the attacker down before he could close the distance again. The remaining attackers, seeing their ambush failing, retreated as quickly as they had appeared, vanishing back into the tree line, and leaving the clearing eerily quiet in the aftermath. Lyra did not care about any of that. She was already kneeling beside Draven, who had shifted back to his human form, blood soaking through his shirt where the blade had struck, his face pale with pain he was clearly trying to control. "Don't move," she said, her hands already working, tearing away fabric to assess the wound, her earlier fear transformed instantly into the sharp, focused clarity she had trained her entire life to summon, in moments exactly like this one. "Let me see it." "It's not as bad as it looks," Draven said through gritted teeth, though the paleness of his skin suggested otherwise. "Let me be the judge of that," Lyra said, pressing firmly against the wound, to slow the bleeding, while she reached into her satchel for the supplies she always carried, thankful now for the habit that had never once failed her. The wound was deep, deeper than Draven's dismissive words suggested, and Lyra worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning and closing it with steady hands, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Draven watched her work in silence, his gold-flecked eyes fixed on her face, with an intensity that made her skin feel warm despite the cold morning air. "You came for me," he said quietly, once the worst of the bleeding had stopped. "You could have stayed hidden. Instead, you moved toward the danger." "You were protecting me," Lyra said simply, not looking up from her work. "It seemed only fair to return the favor, even if my methods were considerably less impressive than yours." Something shifted in the air between them then, something neither of them could easily name, though both of them felt it settle into place with a certainty that made the surrounding chaos of the ambush's aftermath feel suddenly distant and unimportant. It was in that moment, with her hands still pressed against his wound, her eyes meeting his, that Lyra felt it. A pull, deep and instinctive, something her wolf recognized before her mind could fully process it. A recognition that went beyond simple attraction or growing affection into something far more fundamental. She saw the same recognition flash across Draven's face, his eyes widening slightly, his breath catching audibly in his throat. "Mate." The word echoed through her mind with a certainty that left no room for doubt, and judging by the sudden stillness in Draven's expression, he had felt the exact same recognition in that same instant. Neither of them spoke of it immediately. There was too much chaos still unfolding around them, guards checking the perimeter for further threats, advisors shouting orders, the fallen attacker's body being examined for any clue as to which enemy had orchestrated the ambush. Lyra finished treating Draven's wound with hands that had gone slightly unsteady, and Draven allowed her to work without further comment, though his eyes never left her face. It was only later, back within the castle walls, the wound properly dressed, and Draven resting in his private chambers against Lyra's strict medical orders, that the full weight of what had happened settled over both of them. "You felt it too," Draven said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since they returned. "In the clearing." Lyra did not pretend to misunderstand. "Yes," she said simply. "I felt it." Draven was quiet for a long moment, his expression difficult to read, though Lyra thought she saw something like fear flicker briefly across his features before his careful composure reasserted itself. "I did not expect this," he said finally. "I did not want this." The words landed harder than Lyra expected, a small ache blooming in her chest, despite her attempt to remain professional, detached, purely clinical about a bond that clearly meant far more than either of them had been prepared for. "I understand," she said, though she was not entirely certain she did. "After everything you told me, about Alara, about the war, I understand why this might frighten you." "It is not that simple," Draven said, his voice tight with something that sounded almost like frustration, directed at himself rather than at her. "I have spent 11 years building walls, specifically to ensure I never had to feel what I am feeling right now. And in the space of a few short weeks, you have somehow made all of that effort meaningless." "I didn't do that on purpose," Lyra said quietly. "I know," Draven said, That almost makes it worse. He turned away from her then, staring instead toward the window, his jaw tight with tension, his hands clenched at his sides despite his injury. Lyra watched him for a long moment, understanding, with a growing ache in her chest, that whatever had begun to grow between them over these past weeks was about to face a challenge far greater than any rumor or court intrigue. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "I do not know," Draven admitted, and for the first time since she had met him, he sounded truly uncertain, the confident, commanding alpha, replaced by something far more human, far more afraid. "I genuinely do not know." Outside the chamber, unseen, a servant loyal to Lady Seraphine slipped quietly away to deliver news of what had transpired during the hunting party. News that would soon reach ears far more dangerous than any noblewoman's careful scheming, ears belonging to the very enemy who had once left the scar upon Draven's face and had now returned to finish what they had started so many years before. Draven confined Lyra to her quarters the following morning, and the decision landed like a slap despite the gentle wording he used to deliver it. "For your protection," he said, standing stiffly in the doorway of her small room, while 2 guards waited silently in the hallway behind him. "Until we understand who orchestrated the ambush, and why, it is not safe for you to move freely through the castle grounds at present." Lyra stared at him, disbelief slowly curdling into something sharper. "You're locking me in a room." "I am protecting you," Draven said, though even he seemed to hear how weak the justification sounded when spoken aloud. "You're hiding," Lyra said flatly. "From me. From whatever happened yesterday in that clearing." Something flickered across his face, quick and guarded, confirming exactly what she suspected. "This is not the time to discuss that." "It's exactly the time," Lyra said, rising from where she had been sitting, her earlier hurt transforming into something closer to frustration. "You felt what I felt. You know what it means. And instead of talking about it, you're locking me away like a problem you'd rather not look at directly." "I am trying to keep you safe," Draven said, his voice hardening slightly, the familiar composure of the Alpha King settling back over him like armor. "Keep me safe from what, exactly?" Lyra pressed. "From attackers, or from you?" The question landed harder than she intended, and she saw it strike something real beneath his carefully maintained control. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and the silence stretched heavy and uncomfortable between them. "Both, perhaps," he admitted finally, so quietly she almost missed it. "That's not protection," Lyra said. "That's fear, wearing protection as a disguise." Draven's jaw tightened visibly. "You do not understand what it means to lose a mate the way I lost mine." "You're right, I don't," Lyra said, softening slightly despite her frustration. "But I understand what it means to spend 11 years afraid of feeling anything at all, and calling it strength instead of recognizing it for what it actually is." "And what is that, in your expert opinion?" Draven asked, an edge of something sharp entering his voice, though Lyra suspected the sharpness was directed inward rather than at her. "Fear," Lyra said simply. "Just fear, dressed up as wisdom, so it's easier to live with." The words hit their mark clearly, visible in the way Draven's expression flickered, the way his hands tightened briefly at his sides before he forced them to relax. For a moment, Lyra thought he might respond with anger, might finally show the temper that 11 years of rumors suggested lived beneath his controlled exterior. Instead, something in his posture seemed to deflate slightly, the weight of her words settling over him in a way that looked almost painful to witness. "I do not know how to do this," he admitted, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier authority. "I do not know how to feel this way about someone again, without terror consuming every moment alongside it. Every time I allow myself to consider what this bond might mean, all I can see is Alara, falling, and knowing it happened, because she loved me enough to put herself in danger's path." Lyra's heart ached at the raw honesty in his words, all her earlier frustrations softening into something gentler, though she refused to let him retreat entirely into old patterns of avoidance. "Loving someone doesn't guarantee losing them," she said carefully. "What happened to Alara was tragedy, not destiny. You cannot spend the rest of your life punishing yourself, and punishing anyone who might come to care for you, because of something that was never truly within your control to prevent." "How can you be so certain of that?" Draven asked, something raw and desperate beneath the question. "Because I've spent my entire life watching people die, despite my best efforts to save them, Lyra said. And I've learned that grief, real grief, doesn't come from loving too much. It comes from the world being cruel and unpredictable, no matter how carefully we try to protect the people we care about. If I stopped caring for patients every time I lost one, I would have stopped healing anyone a long time ago. And then far more people would have died than the ones I actually managed to save. Draven was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with an intensity that suggested he was turning them over carefully in his mind, weighing them against 11 years of carefully constructed walls. You truly believe that, he said finally. I do, Lyra said, and I believe a king who rules through fear of loss isn't really ruling at all. He's just hiding, behind a throne instead of a wall, but hiding all the same. Something shifted in Draven's expression then, a crack finally forming in the careful composure he had maintained for so long, and for the first time since Lyra had met him, she saw something close to genuine vulnerability in his gold-flecked eyes. I do not want to hide anymore, he said quietly, almost as though the admission surprised even himself. But I do not know how to stop. You start by not locking someone in a room the moment something frightens you, Lyra said, though her tone had softened considerably from her earlier frustration. A ghost of something, almost like a smile, crossed Draven's face, quick and fleeting, but real. Fair enough, he said, and gestured for the guards waiting in the hallway to stand down. You are not confined. I apologize for the impulse. It was born of fear, exactly as you said, and not wisdom. Lyra felt something loosen in her chest at his words, a tension she had not fully realized she was carrying, beginning to ease. Thank you, she said simply. Will you walk with me? Draven asked, an unexpected softness in the request that Lyra had not heard from him before. None of the usual command or careful distance, just a genuine ask, offered with something close to hope. She agreed, and they walked together through the quieter corridors of the castle, away from the eyes of the court, talking in low voices about everything and nothing, about Ashfin and about the war, about Ilara and about the future neither of them yet understood how to navigate. It was the most open either of them had been since the moment Lyra first laughed at his scar in the crowded throne room, and by the time they returned to the study, something fundamental had shifted between them, a wall finally beginning, slowly and carefully, to come down. Neither of them noticed the messenger arriving at the castle gates that same evening, carrying news from the northern border that would soon make it clear the ambush in the forest had been no random attack at all, but the opening move in something far larger and far more dangerous than either of them yet understood. The truth arrived 3 days later, carried by a border scout named Tomlin, who rode into the castle gates, so exhausted he nearly collapsed before reaching the throne room. Lyra was present when he delivered his report, standing near Draven's side, as had become increasingly natural over the past days, and she watched the color drain from Draven's face as the scout's words unfolded. The Ravenshallow line has been rebuilding for years, Tomlin reported, his voice hoarse from hard riding. Quietly, beyond our borders, in territory we believed abandoned since the war, they have gathered warriors, alliances with smaller packs who resent your rule, and resources enough to move against us seriously, for the first time since their defeat 11 years ago. And the ambush during the hunting party, Draven said, his voice tight and controlled despite the visible tension in his shoulders, was almost certainly their doing, Tomlin confirmed. A testing strike, most likely, meant to gauge your defenses, and perhaps eliminate key figures within your court before a larger assault. Lyra felt a cold weight settle in her stomach, the pieces of recent weeks suddenly arranging themselves into a far more dangerous pattern than she had previously understood. The ambush had not been random. Someone had wanted it to happen, had perhaps even known exactly where the hunting party would travel that day. The realization crystallized into something far more troubling several hours later, when one of Draven's most trusted guards, a woman named Bryn who had served in his personal detail for years, approached Lyra privately in the castle gardens, her expression grim. There is something you should know, Bryn said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. About the hunting party route. It was changed at the last moment, the morning of the ambush, on the suggestion of Lady Seraphine, who claimed to have information about better hunting grounds further east. Lyra's blood ran cold. You think she knew? I think it is worth investigating whether Lady Seraphine's suggestion led the hunting party directly into a route the Ravenshallow forces were prepared to intercept, Bryn said carefully. Whether by accident or design. Lyra brought the information to Draven immediately, and watched his expression harden into something cold and dangerous, as the implications settled over him. If Seraphine has been in contact with Ravenshallow forces, working against my court from within my own walls, this goes far beyond simple rumors and rivalry. We need proof before making any accusations, Lyra cautioned. If we're wrong, it could tear the court apart even further than the rumors already have. And if we're right, Draven said grimly, waiting could cost us everything. They moved carefully over the following days, gathering evidence with the discreet help of Bryn and a small circle of guards, loyal enough to trust with such a delicate investigation. Letters were discovered, hidden within Seraphine's private chambers during a search conducted while she attended a court function. Letters written in a careful hand that matched correspondence, known to belong to Ravenshallow's current leader, a distant relative of the very warrior who had once scarred Draven's face and killed his mate. The letters revealed a plan more calculated than even Lyra had feared. Seraphine had been in contact with Ravenshallow for months, feeding them information about castle defenses, court politics, and eventually, about the growing bond between Draven and Lyra, which she viewed as both a personal threat to her ambitions and, more usefully, a potential weakness that Ravenshallow could exploit to destabilize the king's rule from within. She hoped a war would eliminate me, Lyra said, reading through the careful, damning correspondence with a growing sense of horror. As a foreign threat, easily dismissed once removed, and that removing me would leave you vulnerable enough, distracted enough, with grief and anger, for Ravenshallow to strike successfully where they failed 11 years ago. She would sacrifice the entire kingdom for her own ambitions, Draven said, his voice low with barely restrained fury as he read through the letters himself. We need to move carefully, Lyra urged, sensing the danger in his rising anger. If she realizes we know, she may act more recklessly, or warn Ravenshallow that their plans have been discovered before we're prepared to respond. Draven forced himself to calm, drawing on years of discipline despite the personal nature of the betrayal now laid bare before him. You are right, he said finally. We move carefully. We gather what forces we can, without alerting her suspicion, and we prepare for whatever comes next. What came next arrived faster than either of them expected. 2 nights later, as the castle settled into its usual evening quiet, the northern watchtowers sounded the alarm, their horns cutting through the darkness with an urgency that sent guards scrambling across the grounds and pulled Draven from his private study, with Lyra close behind him. Ravenshallow forces have crossed the border, a breathless guard reported, having sprinted the distance from the outer walls to deliver the news personally. Moving fast, toward the castle itself, they will reach us within hours. Draven's expression hardened into the cold, commanding focus of a warrior king preparing for battle. All traces of the vulnerable man who had walked quietly through the corridors with Lyra just days before, now buried beneath necessary resolve. Sound the full alarm, he ordered. Every guard, every warrior within these walls, prepare for defense. This ends tonight, one way or another. Lyra felt fear settle deep in her chest, not for herself, but for Draven, for the castle full of people she had come to care about, despite her initial reluctance to remain here at all. For the fragile bond that had grown between herself and the king, in the midst of so much danger and uncertainty. As guards scrambled to prepare the castle's defenses, Draven turned to her, his gold-flecked eyes intense with something that looked like both determination and fear, though not fear for himself. You should retreat to the deepest safe room within the castle, he said. This will not be safe for you. I'm not hiding, Lyra said firmly, echoing words she had spoken once before, in a different context, but with equal conviction. You'll need a healer once this begins, and I intend to be useful, not hidden away while everyone I care about fights for their lives. Something passed across Draven's face, a mixture of frustration at her stubbornness, and something warmer, something that looked almost like pride, despite the danger of the moment. Stay close to Bryn, then, he said finally, clearly recognizing the futility of arguing further. She will keep you as safe as possible, while still allowing you to help where you are needed. Lyra nodded, and for one brief moment, amid the chaos of preparation swirling around them, Draven reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and warm, despite everything unfolding around them. "Whatever happens tonight," he said quietly, "I am glad you laughed at my scar in that throne room, all those weeks ago. I am glad for every moment since, even the difficult ones." "We'll have time for that conversation properly," Lyra said, squeezing his hand firmly. "Once tonight is over." He nodded, released her hand, and turned to face the gathering storm, the Alpha King preparing once again to defend everything he had built, and everyone he had come, slowly and carefully, to allow himself to care about once more. The attack came just before midnight, and the castle grounds erupted into chaos the moment Ravenshallow's forces breached the outer defenses. Lyra had positioned herself in the castle's main hall, which had been converted hastily into a treatment area for wounded warriors, working alongside Bryn and a handful of other healers who had been summoned from within the castle staff. The sounds of battle carried clearly through the stone walls, shouts and clashing steel, and the occasional roar of a wolf mid-transformation, and Lyra forced herself to focus on the wounded, arriving in increasing numbers, rather than the fear clawing at her chest for Draven's safety. The battle raged for hours, the tide shifting back and forth, as Draven's forces, though caught somewhat unprepared, fought with the fierce determination of warriors defending their home. Lyra worked tirelessly, closing wounds and stopping bleeding, and offering what comfort she could to warriors frightened and in pain, her hands steady, even as her mind raced with worry, for the man leading the defense somewhere beyond these walls. It was well past midnight when the doors to the main hall burst open, and Draven himself was carried in, supported between two guards, blood soaking through his side where a blade had found purchase during the fiercest part of the fighting. Lyra's heart nearly stopped at the sight of him, but training took over immediately, pushing aside personal terror in favor of the clinical focus that had saved countless lives before this one. She moved to him immediately, guiding the guards to lay him carefully on the nearest table, her hands already working to assess the damage. "The battle," she said urgently, even as she worked. "How does it stand?" "We are winning," one of the guards reported, though his tone carried exhaustion rather than triumph. "Ravenshallow's forces are retreating, but the king insisted on continuing to fight, even after taking this wound. He would not withdraw until the battle turned decisively in our favor." Of course he wouldn't, Lyra thought, even as fear and frustration mixed together in her chest. She worked quickly, cleaning and closing the wound with the same steady precision she had used weeks before in that forest clearing, refusing to let her hands shake despite the personal stakes now weighing on every stitch. Draven remained conscious throughout, his gold-flecked eyes fixed on her face even through the pain, and when she finally finished closing the wound, he reached up weakly to catch her hand. "Lady Seraphine," he said, his voice strained but urgent. "Has she been apprehended?" "Bryn's guards moved on her chambers the moment the attack began," Lyra confirmed, having received word just moments before Draven's arrival. "She was found attempting to flee toward the northern gate, likely hoping to escape to Ravenshallow forces amid the chaos. She has been captured." Relief flickered across Draven's pale features, followed quickly by something harder, colder. The weight of betrayal from someone within his own court, finally settling into anger, now that the immediate crisis had begun to ease. "Good," he said simply, though the single word carried the full weight of judgment yet to come. As dawn broke over the castle grounds, word spread that Ravenshallow's remaining forces had retreated fully across the border, their attack decisively repelled, their plans for conquest crumbling in the face of Draven's determined defense, and the exposure of Seraphine's betrayal from within. The full extent of what had happened became clear over the following days, as Seraphine, faced with undeniable evidence of her correspondence with Ravenshallow, finally admitted the full scope of her conspiracy before the assembled court. She had hoped to eliminate Lyra, destabilize Draven's rule through grief and chaos, and position herself to benefit from the resulting power vacuum, allying secretly with the very enemy who had once nearly destroyed everything Draven's family had built. The court that gathered to hear her judgment was different from the one that had witnessed Lyra's laugh so many weeks before. Where once the hall had held only fear and rigid formality, something had shifted in the weeks since, a court that had watched their king slowly become more human, more present, more willing to acknowledge vulnerability, alongside strength. Draven stood before them all, his wound healing steadily under Lyra's continued care, his expression grave, as he delivered judgment against the woman who had nearly cost him everything. But when the formal proceedings concluded, and the court began to disperse, he did something no one in that hall had ever witnessed before. He reached for Lyra's hand in front of the entire assembled court, drawing her forward to stand beside him, rather than in the shadows, where she had spent so many weeks watching from a careful distance. "There is something else the court should know," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, silencing the murmurs of departing nobles and guards alike. "Weeks ago, in this very hall, a healer from Ashfen laughed at a scar I have carried for 11 years, a scar everyone else in this castle learned to avoid mentioning entirely. She did not know then that her honesty would become the thing that finally allowed me to feel something other than grief and fear, after more than a decade of hiding behind both." The hall had gone utterly silent, every eye fixed on the king and the healer standing beside him, hand in hand, in a moment none of them had ever expected to witness.
"I am claiming Lyra Ashworth as my mate," Draven continued, his voice steady and clear despite the magnitude of the declaration.
"Before this court, and before anyone who might question whether a border healer deserves such a place beside a king, she has earned it, not through flattery or ambition, but through honesty. I did not know I still needed, until she offered it freely, at considerable risk to herself." The silence broke into a wave of murmurs, some shocked, some clearly delighted, the reaction as varied as the court itself. But beneath the noise, Lyra felt something settle deep in her chest, a certainty she had been afraid to fully acknowledge, until this exact moment, standing before an entire kingdom, with her hand held firmly in his. "I laughed at your scar, because I saw something no one else seemed willing to see," she said quietly, though her words carried in the newly silent hall, "that you were someone who had survived something terrible, and deserved better than a world too afraid to acknowledge it honestly." Draven's expression softened into something Lyra had never seen before, something warm and unguarded and entirely genuine. "And I am grateful, every single day since, that you were brave enough to say so." The bonding ceremony took place 3 weeks later, once Draven's wound had fully healed, and the castle had settled into a new, steadier rhythm, following the defeat of Ravenshallow's forces and the departure of Lady Seraphine, who had been stripped of her titles and exiled from the 9 territories entirely. Her ambitions finally and permanently ended. The hall that had once frozen in horror at the sound of Lyra's laugh was transformed for the occasion, filled with warm light and the gathered warmth of a court that had, slowly and genuinely, come to embrace the healer from Ashfen as something far more than a curious anomaly in their king's otherwise carefully controlled life. Lyra stood at the front of the hall, dressed simply but elegantly, her nerves settled by the steady presence of Draven beside her, his hand warm around hers, his scar visible and unhidden, no longer something the court avoided mentioning, but something he wore now with a quiet, hard-won confidence. "Do you understand," the officiant asked, following the traditional words of the bonding ceremony, "that this bond, once sealed, cannot be undone, that you commit not only your body, but your heart, your future, your very self to this union?" "I understand," Draven said, his voice steady and certain in a way that carried none of the fear that had once made him confine Lyra to her quarters, after their bond first revealed itself in that dangerous forest clearing. "I understand," Lyra echoed, meeting his gold-flecked eyes with a certainty of her own. As the final words of the ceremony were spoken, and the ancient bond between them settled fully into place, Lyra felt something shift, a warmth spreading through her chest that felt like coming home to a place she had not known she was searching for. The court erupted into celebration once the ceremony concluded, and Lyra found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in weeks, surrounded by well-wishes from guards and servants and nobles alike who had, over the preceding months, come to see her not as a strange curiosity or a dangerous influence, but as someone who belonged truly and rightfully beside their king. Later that evening, once the formal celebrations had wound down and the great hall had emptied of most of its guests, Draven found Lyra standing near the tall windows, looking out over the castle grounds bathed in moonlight, the same grounds that had witnessed a hunting party ambush, a desperate battle, and everything in between that had led them to this quiet, peaceful moment. "You know," Lyra said, without turning to look at him as he approached, "I still think about that laugh sometimes, how close I came to losing everything, over something so small and involuntary. I think about it too, Draven admitted, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers naturally, the way it had begun to do so often over the past weeks. Though I have come to be endlessly grateful for it, rather than troubled. I should probably warn you, Lyra said, a teasing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, as she finally turned to look at him, that I don't intend to stop laughing at you entirely, now that we're bonded. Someone needs to keep you from taking yourself too seriously. Something warm and genuine crossed Draven's face, an expression Lyra had come to treasure over the past months precisely because it appeared so rarely, and always felt so hard-won when it did. I would not want it any other way, he said softly. And for the first time in 11 long years, King Draven Voss smiled, truly smiled, the scar along his jaw catching moonlight, in a way that no longer looked like a wound to be hidden, but a mark of everything he had survived, and everything, finally, that he had allowed himself to find on the other side of it. Outside the tall windows, the mountains of the 9 territories stretched quiet and peaceful beneath the night sky, a kingdom finally settling into a steadier future, built not on fear or careful walls, but on the kind of honesty that had begun, so many months before, with a single unexpected laugh in a silent throne room, and had grown, slowly and surely, into something neither of them had dared to hope for, but both of them, in the end, had been brave enough to claim.